Thousands of responsible gun owners have been blindsided by new laws that suddenly classify their long-trusted rifles, shotguns, and pistols as restricted weapons. There was no big announcement, no prime-time political debate, just a subtle change buried deep in committee paperwork that quietly flipped the script on lawful ownership. So how did a bill that was originally supposed to deal only with 50 caliber rifles morph into sweeping legislation that targets nearly every semi-automatic firearm in the region? In this video, we're going to unpack how a narrowly written measure aimed at a very specific caliber got hijacked and twisted into one of the broadest gun bans we've seen in the United States. We'll also break down how this kind of legal maneuvering could be used in other states, and what you can do now to push back before it spreads nationwide. It all began with House Bill 893. It was a short proposal, just 500 words, that aimed to pull 50 caliber rifles off local shelves. Not great, but at least it was straightforward. However, when the bill missed its official filing window, it should have died on the legislative floor. Instead, leadership ripped out its original contents, replaced it with over 2,000 words of new restrictions, slapped a fresh label on it as Senate Bill 401, and brought it back with barely a whisper to the public. This rewritten version doesn't just revisit the old proposal, it transforms firearm law entirely. It clamps down on guns with detachable magazines, outlaws semi-automatic shotguns that can hold more than 9 shells, and invents a brand new classification, so-called assault pistols. That new category targets compact handguns equipped with features like threaded barrels, extended magazines, or vertical foregrips. Even carbines with fixed magazines that hold 15 rounds are flagged just for their capacity alone. And if you're a collector who enjoys wood-stocked, historically significant firearms, you're not safe either. The MOVN used by American forces since the 1940s is now prohibited from being transferred simply because it was never built with 10-round magazines in the first place. The MO rifle, if it has a flash suppressor or bayonet lug, is likewise outlawed. Even the Mini 14 and Mini 30, two rifles often considered sporting or non-threatening, are banned outright despite being explicitly protected under older laws in states like Colorado. Manufacturers of lever-action firearms are watching all this very closely. If any of them were to introduce a side-loading gate that works with detachable magazines, the entire class of rifles could be classified as banned under the vague and overreaching language of this bill. Hunters using semi-automatic shotguns aren't spared either. Any shotgun that can accept a tube extension pushing its capacity beyond 9 shells is now locked down. Future sales and transfers? Not happening. Let's take a breath here. Ask yourself, does this sound like an isolated issue for just one coastal state? Or does it feel like a blueprint for something bigger? Could this happen where you live? Because if they can do this without warning or public input there, they can try it anywhere. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read each and every one. Your feedback helps guide the conversations we have on this channel. Let your voice be heard before another committee decides it's time to silence gun owners across the country. Let's circle back to how this bill made it through in the first place. By taking an expired proposal and injecting it with brand new restrictions, anti-Second Amendment lawmakers effectively sidestepped the usual public transparency rules. They avoided drafting fresh legislation, opting instead to rewrite a dormant bill and then pushed it forward with barely any public notice. Hearings were posted on such short timelines that many citizens from neighboring islands couldn't arrange the travel or time off to show up and speak. Even so, gun owners packed the hearing rooms, delivering testimony until the clock ran out. The committee chairs responded with what's called a decision-making by recess, a backroom tactic where voting happens privately, away from cameras and public accountability. Just like that, the bill passed the House and is now on track to sail through a gun control-friendly Senate before hitting the desk of a governor known for signing nearly every piece of anti-gun legislation that crosses it. This kind of political sleight of hand only tightens the screws on what is already one of the most suffocating gun control climates in the country. In Honolulu, trying to buy a firearm feels like navigating red tape designed to wear you down. If you want to purchase a handgun, the state forces you to apply for a permit tied to the firearm's specific serial number, as if you need the government's blessing to own a tool guaranteed under the Constitution. You're required to provide passport-style photographs, get fingerprinted like a criminal, and fork over fees that make exercising your rights feel more like paying ransom. After all that, you're subjected to a mandatory 14-day waiting period, treating law-abiding citizens like impulsive teenagers instead of responsible adults. And it doesn't stop with handguns. You'll go through the same ordeal to legally buy a long gun, even if it's just a bolt-action hunting rifle. Once you finally picked up your firearm, the state gives you only 5 days to take it, often across congested roads and under frustrating conditions, to the nearest police department for serial number registration into a centralized government database. As for concealed carry, it might as well be fiction. Out of nearly 1.5 million residents, only around 227 permits have been issued, making legally carrying a firearm for self-defense almost a myth. Now, layer Senate Bill 401 on top of all this. The message becomes clear. Sure, you can own what you already have for now, but don't plan on fixing it, handing it down to your kids, or taking it with you if you leave. Proponents of this bill claim it only targets so-called military-style firearms. They throw around emotionally charged buzzwords like pistol grip, threaded muzzle, and vertical foregrip, hoping to stir panic in people who don't know the difference between a semi-automatic rifle and a fully automatic machine gun. The language used seems custom, designed to confuse the uninformed into believing average citizens are stockpiling war machines. But anyone who's ever handled a modern sporting rifle knows better. A semi-automatic firearm, regardless of its aesthetics, still functions the same. One squeeze of the trigger fires one round. Features like a pistol grip or a threaded barrel for attaching legal muzzle brakes or flash suppressors have nothing to do with the rate of fire. Yet this rhetoric suggests that installing a flashlight or mounting a hand stop somehow turns a rimfire plinker into battlefield hardware. And the bill doesn't stop at so-called tactical gear. It stretches to cover any firearm that simply looks intimidating to someone unfamiliar with the platform. Thumbhole stocks built for comfort and recoil control are now suspicious. Forward hand stops meant to prevent burns on a hot barrel are outlawed. Flash suppressors, which help preserve night vision during dusk or evening range sessions, are banned outright. Even home defense pistols, with accessory rails for mounting a light, are swept up in the restrictions. Something as ubiquitous as a Ruger 1022, when placed in an aftermarket chassis with a pistol grip or light attachment, could be labeled an assault weapon under the new law. It's not about how firearms work, it's about how they look to people writing the rules. What makes this all the more absurd is that Hawaii already ranks among the safest states in the nation when it comes to violent crime. Data from the state shows that most gun-related deaths are suicides, a heartbreaking issue that has nothing to do with magazine capacity or pistol grips. And while you won't hear it on the evening news, defensive gun use is very likely being suppressed by these very restrictions, which make it nearly impossible for honest citizens to act in self-defense without running afoul of the law. The ones who pay the price are not criminals, they're veterans, retirees, and working families who bought a beloved M1 Garand or M1 carbine decades ago and are now being told they cannot pass them on to their children. Legal action is already underway. Groups like the Hawaii Firearms Coalition and the Second Amendment Foundation are gearing up to challenge this in court under the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. That ruling demands that modern gun laws must be rooted in the text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment. Semi-automatic firearms with detachable magazines have been around since the 1800s. The 1 Garand and M1 carbine have been common civilian firearms for generations. There's no historical basis to ban them. And Bruin says public safety arguments don't override constitutional protections. The courts will have to decide, do these new laws meet the constitutional standard, or are they just another attempt to bury gun rights under bureaucratic control? While an initial court injunction might temporarily pause the rollout of this law, anyone familiar with the Ninth Circuit knows the long game. That court has a well-documented history of upholding gun control laws, which means the true fight will almost certainly end up at the doorstep of the United States Supreme Court. And if you live in Texas, Florida, or any state that prides itself on respecting the Second Amendment, you might be wondering, why should I care about what's happening in Hawaii? The answer is simple: because these legislative tactics are portable. In Colorado, a wave of restrictive laws passed in 2013 after years of relative calm. Oregon used a single-ballot initiative to implement sweeping firearm restrictions. Washington state took a slower, more methodical route, gradually tightening the noose over more than a decade. The strategy often looks familiar. Start with a narrowly tailored proposal marketed as reasonable, then gradually expand it by tacking on amendments closing so-called loopholes or adding new categories of restricted features. The final result: a sweeping ban that goes far beyond what was initially sold to the public. Hawaii's latest move takes this formula to the next level. Instead of drafting something new, lawmakers reanimated a defunct bill, kept public awareness low by avoiding media coverage, and rushed the vote through during the busy tourist season when fewer locals might be watching. If this model holds up in court, expect lawmakers in states like California or Washington to see it as a template worth copying. It's also worth noting that Hawaii's pre-existing firearm registration system lays the groundwork for more aggressive moves down the road, because the state already tracks firearm serial numbers in a centralized database. Passing a future law that criminalizes ownership of newly banned items becomes a matter of enforcement, not legislation. This isn't hypothetical. New Jersey used this tactic to outlaw bump stocks, demanding their surrender without compensation. Illinois attempted something similar with stabilizing braces before the courts stepped in. Once the state knows exactly what firearms are in circulation and who owns them, confiscation becomes more logistical than legal. There's also a mental health component in Senate Bill 401 that raises serious red flags. The bill reportedly allows authorities to deny permits based on credible information that someone may be unstable. That's an incredibly vague and subjective standard. Could seeking therapy for postpartum depression trigger a red flag? Could veterans who've responsibly sought help for PTSD be swept up in this net? We tell our service members to get help when they need it, but under laws like this, doing so could risk their right to keep and bear arms. It creates a no-win situation. Seek treatment and risk being disarmed, or suffer in silence. That's a dangerous precedent, and one that could easily spread beyond Hawaii if not challenged. The economic consequences are just as troubling. Small gun shops rely heavily on selling automatic firearms, standard capacity magazines, and related accessories. These restrictions threaten to gut their inventory, potentially forcing many of them to close their doors. That means lost jobs, reduced access to firearm education and training, and fewer options for the very law-abiding citizens these laws claim to protect. It's hard to argue that public safety is enhanced by making it harder for people to learn how to safely use and store their firearms. Some might say, "I'm never moving to Hawaii, why should I care?" But life has a way of surprising people. A military transfer, college admission, or new job could send you anywhere in the country. Under Senate Bill 401, bringing a commonly owned firearm like a Glock 17 with standard capacity magazines into Hawaii could land you in felony territory. That means you'd be forced to sell your legally owned property just to comply with the state's laws. And if more states follow this example, our children might grow up believing that standard capacity magazines and ergonomic stocks are somehow radical. That's where the intent of the Founding Fathers matters. Men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison didn't just support private firearm ownership, they expected citizens to own arms equivalent to the standard infantry weapons of their time. Back then, that meant muskets and rifles. Today, it arguably means semi-automatic rifles with standard capacity magazines. Eroding this parity shifts the power dynamic between the governed and the government. Once citizens are disarmed or restricted to antique hardware, the right to bear arms becomes a regulated privilege, not a safeguard of liberty. History backs this up. Look at California. The 1989 Roberti-Russo Act banned a list of specific firearm models. Manufacturers adapted with compliant designs. So in 1999, lawmakers banned certain features instead, like pistol grips or flash suppressors. Owners again adjusted, using bullet buttons and fixed magazines. In response, Senate Bill 880 closed that so-called loophole, effectively banning even those workarounds and demanding registration or removal from the state. In some cases, law enforcement reportedly used social media to identify non-compliant firearms during unrelated investigations. That kind of escalation reveals a deeper problem. Many of the lawmakers drafting these bans have a limited understanding of firearms. Detachable box magazines are not a modern invention. James Paris Lee patented them in 1879. Threaded barrels predate the First World War and were originally used to attach muzzle devices for improved visibility or reduced recoil. Vertical foregrips go back over a century, with examples like the Browning automatic rifle carried by U.S. soldiers in the early 20th century. These features are not some post-apocalyptic innovation, they are part of American firearms history. Federal courts have started applying stricter scrutiny to these kinds of laws following the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. In California, Judge Roger Benitez struck down the state's ban on standard capacity magazines, calling out lawmakers for effectively flipping constitutional rights on their head. The Fourth Circuit also pushed back, overturning major parts of Maryland's restrictive handgun roster law. Under Bruin, any law that limits the right to own firearms commonly used by the American people must be justified by a clear historical precedent dating back to the founding era. And let's be honest, there were no colonial laws banning the Brown Bess musket because it carried too much powder. But not all change happens in court. Cultural resistance can be just as powerful as legal battles. When Americans refuse to be shamed or silenced for exercising a constitutional right, the ground can shift. Look at what happened with pistol braces. The ATF tried to reclassify them, and instead, the community pushed back. Non-compliance soared, lawsuits followed, and enforcement stalled. The same is true for homemade firearms, despite bans or red tape. They remain widespread in states with aggressive restrictions. When the government overreaches, the American spirit of innovation often rises to meet it. Here's the nightmare scenario for advocates of sweeping gun control. Once enough citizens recognize the cycle, restrict, register, confiscate, they may stop playing the incremental compromise game altogether. Instead, they dig in. They show up to vote. They donate to legal fights. They become single-issue voters. And laws like Hawaii's could be the final straw that lights that fire on the mainland. To be clear, momentum does not only flow in one direction. Illinois passed a broad ban on semi-automatics, but dozens of sheriffs across the state publicly said they would not enforce the confiscation orders, and the lawsuits came quickly. In Virginia, public outrage over proposed registration laws helped flip the state legislature, and the new majority promptly shut those bills down. Even in heavily regulated Maryland, legal pressure forced lawmakers to scale back their restrictions on concealed carry. One issue often overlooked is media silence. When small policy changes are made, national outlets often run endless commentary. But when an entire state overhauls its firearms laws through procedural gamesmanship, the silence is deafening. Why? Maybe it's because there's no dramatic footage. Maybe because the story doesn't serve a preferred narrative. Whatever the reason, it leaves the responsibility of spreading the word to independent voices and concerned citizens. That's where content like this plays a critical role. When you like, comment, and share, you push this information into the feed of someone who might otherwise never hear about it. In a world where algorithms throttle reach, your engagement becomes a form of resistance. This battle in Hawaii is not finished. Residents still have the chance to speak up, call your senators, show up to hearings, and make your voice heard before final votes are cast. If you live on the mainland, you can still help. Donate to the legal defense efforts, educate others about the situation, and push your own legislators to pass preemption laws that stop this kind of legislation from spreading. Most importantly, keep pushing for policies that restore balance, like shall issue permits that align with the Bruin ruling, constitutional carry laws, and the protection of standard firearms used by millions of responsible Americans. I refuse to sit by and watch the rights earned and defended by generations before us be erased through red tape and political maneuvering. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this valuable, consider hitting that like button, sharing this with others, and subscribing for more in-depth content on your rights and the laws affecting them. Thanks for watching, and stay vigilant.